It's just about 19 minutes after the hour of 7 o'clock on the Now Morning Show. I'm Kimberly D'Souza. Now, the Cabinet's appointed interagency task force commenced its first meeting on May 4th to develop the work plan for the implementation of the recommendations of the independent investigative report into the abuse of children at children's homes, rehabilitation centers, and other institutions which provide residential care for children. And so to tell us more about the task force is Permanent Secretary of Gender and Child Affairs at the Office of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Jacinta Bailey-Sobers. Mrs. Sobers, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on Now.
Good morning, Kimberly, and good morning to the crew on the set this morning of the Now Morning program. Thanks for inviting the Gender and Child Affairs Division, and me in particular, to
Of course, Ms. Sobers. I mean, we basically had to have you come in because we've been hearing about the conversation surrounding some of these children's home. So just to provide some context, can you tell us what would have caused, establishing the task force in the first place?
Sure. So just to give a brief history, in June 2021, the Cabinet would have approved the investigation and also the investigation team headed by retired Justice Jones to undertake the investigation into the children's homes and community residences and the allegations of child abuse. That investigation committee had 4 months to do their investigation, and they were given a 1.5-month extension. So in December 2021, they would have submitted the report to the Gender and Child Affairs Division. That report, of course, was sent to the Cabinet, and Cabinet in March would have approved for the report to be sent to the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs, and also for the appointment of a task force to review the recommendations and to develop a work plan. So that's where the task force that I'm chairing comes in.
And in terms of the remit of the task force, can you just share with us some of the areas of focus?
Sure. Well, in particular, the task force has been mandated to review the recommendations and to come up with a work plan, identifying the short, medium, and long-term timeframes for implementation of the recommendations, and also to submit to the Cabinet within a 6-week period. So the task force would have commenced, as you rightly said, its work on the 4th of May. And we are working, of course, with the timeframes that have been given to us. And with regard to an approach to the work of the task force, we have divided ourselves into 4 teams in order to do the work. With regard to the composition, and I know some persons are interested in the composition, we have 3 persons from the Division of Gender and Child Affairs, including myself as the Permanent Secretary, and 2 technical officers. We have 3 persons from the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, the acting director, and 2 deputy directors. We also have a representative from the Tobago House of Assembly, from the Ministry of Youth Development and National Service, from the Office of the Attorney General and the Ministry of Legal Affairs, a senior legal officer, the Division of the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. We have the Assistant Director of Family Services from that ministry. So I think that is the composition. We have a 12-member team, and we have been working, as I indicated, dividing the recommendations into the 7 thematic areas the recommendations fall under. And the teams looking at those 7 areas. So that's how we will be approaching the work. I'm sure you would be interested to know what those areas are. For example, Team 1 will be looking at legislation and the enforcement of licensing and monitoring requirements for the children's homes. As I indicated, these are the areas that the recommendations fall under. Public financing for safeguarding, care, and protection of children, and for state coordination and collaboration, which was identified as a key area for work to be done. Team 3 will look at operations and organizational redesign of the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. And Team 4 is looking at recommendations with regard to abuse and absconding and operating systems for children's residences and child support centers. So this is what we have been looking at, and we expect to meet every week. The sub teams are meeting on their own, and we come back as a task force to look at what we've come up with next Monday, the 16th.
Now, Mrs. Sobers, you mentioned, was it 7 areas of focus? Or you
Seven
mentioned,
areas, 7 thematic areas of focus with respect to the recommendations. Yes.
and what are those 7 areas, if you can share it with us as well?
Okay, so as I indicated, the teams are looking at those areas, and it's legislation for Team 1 and enforcement of licensing and monitoring requirements. That's 2 areas. Then we have the area of public financing for safeguarding care and protection of children, and collaboration and coordination of state agencies. So that's 4. The 5th is operations and redesigning of the Children's Authority. That's the 5th. And the last 2, abuse and absconding and operating systems for children's residences and child support centers. So those are the 7 main areas of the recommendation. And what we have already come up with for the work plan is the template that we will submit the work plan, the framework for it. And it's important to note that we'll be looking at all the recommendations and dividing them into the timeframes of short, medium, and long term. We'll be looking at the responsible agencies for each of the recommendations, the actions that are already being taken, and that's really important because we are, as a task force, we understand the urgency of implementation, and we recognize that some persons, Kimberly, might be saying, what's the use of this task force while Rome is burning, the fiddler is fiddling, while the grass is growing, the horses are starving. We need to take some urgent action. So the task force has agreed that while we are preparing the work plan, we will also work to advance the actions that are already in train and the projects that will impact on the recommendations. So that is something that we have been putting our mind to while we develop the work plan. So
Ms.
it
Sobers, I'm
also in the,
actually Ms. Sobers, I was just about to
yes,
say, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because yesterday I spoke to Sister Greenwich, who of course is at the St. Dominic's Children's Home, and she was saying,
yeah.
you know, we have been here before where we have gotten the reports, we have done the recommendations, and we've been here before. And so she was wondering what is going to be different from then to now with this new task force that's in place.
That gives me an opportunity, Kimberly, to clarify a matter which it's in the public domain. This task force has a specific remit, which is to come up with a work plan divided into short, medium, and long-term time frames for implementation. So that's our remit. Now, in the report of the investigation team, there was a recommendation for the establishment of an interagency task force. And this task force had an assignment which will actually be the collaboration of the various agencies that will be responsible for implementation, and also overseeing the implementation of the recommendations. So we are an interim task force. We are not the task force that will implement. We are just working to come up with the work plan, and it's important to understand why that is necessary. Because if we have a work plan, then we can have a strategic approach to the implementation of the recommendations, which will make it more effective and which will enable Cabinet, especially since we are in the throes of developing the 2023 fiscal budget, to know what are the requirements for strengthening the child protection system for fiscal 2023. So the work plan is going to be useful. It's going to add value. So there's a reason for this interim task force, but we are going to develop the other task force, the composition of that task force, and submit it to cabinet. And they would be the ones to oversee implementation of the work plan. So I
Now,
needed
Mrs.
to
Sobers,
clarify that
right.
for the public.
Of course. Now, Mr. Sobers, I'm just thinking about when the task force submits its report at the end of June. Can you speak to what's going to happen after that?
What will happen in my view is that the task force to implement will now take over and move towards the short-term recommendations. As I indicated, there are a number of projects that are already in train with respect to the short-term recommendations. And if you will allow me, I could share in particular with regard to transitional homes. So the Ministry of Youth Development and National Services, it's already working on the construction of the home at Diego Martin, where the old St. Michael's School for Boys was, and that particular facility will be for children in need of supervision, boys. There are also a number of facilities that they are looking at for the target group that has been identified in the report, working on commissioning the transition home for girls on Henry Street. You would have heard about that one, I am sure. It's Josephine Shaw. Most people know who live in Port of Spain know about that facility, and they're also looking at other facilities in Couva, while social development is working on a facility in Carapo for girls, and other ministries are looking at other facilities at the same time. So it's not that the task force is coming up with this work plan and nothing is happening. There's a lot that is happening that will impact the situation.
Right. And Ms. Sobers, when the report was published, a lot of people were discussing the issue of the registration of some of these homes, and some were actually calling for the homes to be closed. I mean, can I get your opinion on this? Is this something that the ministry may look into?
There are approximately 39 children's homes. The government provides funding for at least 32 of those homes. Usually, we refer to the children's homes as the bigger homes like St. Dominic's and St. Jude's and St. Mary's, and the others we call community residences, which are mainly run by NGOs. Of the 32 receiving government funding, there are about 18 of those homes that are still to be licensed. And the understanding is that the Children's Authority, and whose responsibility this remit falls for licensing, is in communication with these homes on a continuous basis in terms of closing the gaps that will bring them to a point of licensing the homes. We, as a division, we've also been assisting because there are some areas that are within the remit of the public service to assist the homes to be able to get licensed. And the thinking is that while the children who are wards of the state are in these organizations, the government will remain committed to providing financing for their upkeep and their well-being.
Nice. Mrs. Bailey Sobers, thank you so much for joining us on the Now Morning Show and sharing just a bit about the work of the task force as a result of the report. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you also, Kimberly. And if you will allow me just one clarification, we have
Sure.
$126 million that has been allocated not to this task force, but to the ministries and organizations who are already undertaking projects that will impact the recommendations. So just needed to make that clarification and to thank you again for having me.
No problem, Ms.
Thank you.
Sobers. Always a pleasure. Have a great one.
Have a great rest of the day.